And we're back with another episode of Café con Chisme. I'm Seb.
And I'm Yaz.
And we hope all of you out there are taking care of yourselves and making space for yourselves and for each other and showing up and checking in with your Black friends and family and seeing how they're doing, seeing what you can do to help. Today's episode is kind of continuing the conversations we've been having over the last few episodes, kind of how to make sense and how to work through some of these ideas and comments that we are seeing a lot of on social media in the context of Black Lives Matter and the protests that have been happening across the country. Namely, I think we wanted to say too that as non-Black Latinx people, our intention here is never to speak for those experiences, but do what we can as non-Black Latinx people to kind of work through some of these ideas for other non-Black Latinx folks to kind of understand and show up for Black communities as well. And so that's kind of going to be guiding today's episode and conversation, largely around looking at the intersections of unity amongst non-Black people of color or non-Black Latinx folks and the Black community. And how to kind of combat some of those really negative and stigmatized comments that we've been seeing coming from mostly white Latinx and non-Black Latinx people in regard to everything that's happening. I don't know, if you want to add something there.
Oh yeah, that's spot on.
So I guess a good place to start, if you're not sure what we're talking about, right? And we mentioned this, I think, last time as well, but in the past week or so since the protests and movement has been happening, we've seen a lot of Latinx people commenting with really derailing tweets and posts asking things like, what about the kids in detention? Or have we forgotten about, immigrants who are detained? Why haven't Black folks protested for immigrants, right? What about Mexican Lives Matter? Like undocumented folks are just as vulnerable, right? Why are we taking the focus here? And I guess what we wanted to do in this episode is kind of give some historical context, a little bit of how a lot of those things are not true, right? There has been throughout history, especially in LA and Southern California, a long history of Black and Mexican specifically, because that's kind of the predominant group, but other Latinx communities as well, have been, working together in different moments throughout history. And so how a lot of those comments are really not rooted in anything foundational. And we'll get more into where that rhetoric comes from later on in the episode. But I guess we would start here right now is to kind of give some historical context. There is a long history of collaboration between Black and Mexican folks, right? But oftentimes the only public narrative that we hear or read or see is that of racial tension amongst the two groups. And, a lot of different scholars have written about it, obviously, over the years. But really kind of when you hear the narrative of Black and Brown relations or the commentary around Black and Brown relations, and I say Brown, which I think gets substituted for Mexican, and we're talking, again, kind of in an LA context because this looks different in different parts of the country. But to really understand how those narratives about issues or kind of tension between the two groups are largely built around ideas of competition for resources, competition for political power, competition for space, right? And actual geographic space and regional space, access to employment, right? And then these kind of different narratives that get kind of tossed back and forth between the two communities and that get received by both from white folks, right? And so to look back, I reference a book by Gay Teresa Johnson. It's a book called Spaces of Conflict, Sounds of Solidarity. It's a really great book if you're interested in more historical kind of a historical kind of context of Black and brown relations, specifically in LA, and different points of collaboration that are not just political, but also about like culture and music and space. And so in her book, she kind of gives a great overview in the beginning of looking at we need to, when we talk about coalitional movements, when we talk about race relations amongst different racial and ethnic groups, at least in California, right, there's a long history going back to thinking about the Japanese and Mexican beat workers in Oxnard in 1903, thinking about the longshoremen unions that were racially integrated in 1934, farm worker unions, the 30s that were, Mexicans and Filipino communities, the Peace Pact by Reyes Lopez Tijerina, who was an activist of the Chicano movement, and their Peace Pact with the Black Panthers. Cesar Chavez working with Bobby Seale and mutual support for each other's constituents, Ralph Abernathy and Corky Gonzalez also for the People's March in 1968. So you have, and those are just, kind of just giving some examples. I encourage you to kind of research that more on your own if you're interested. But I think that these longer histories, right, are indicative that the narratives that we get sold or that we get told in the media about Black and brown people is often centered around crime and criminality, around violence, when in fact there is like a larger trajectory, and even till today of the present, right, of Mexican communities and Black communities working together.
Yeah. And how the FBI worked to dismantle a lot of that collaboration.
Oh, definitely.
Right?
There's a lot of those parallels have a lot to do with infiltration by the FBI and other kind of forces like that.
Right. And so that's like a great historical context to continue the conversation on how institutions have aided this sort of divide between the Black and brown community. And we can I think we're going to touch a little bit on various institutions, all of them working towards the same goal, which is to keep Black and brown folks from working together. But we can start with like the economic power structure, right? When we talk about capitalism, more specifically neoliberalism, right? Which we know works to kind of dismantle countries in Latin America and their economic structures for the sole purpose of like severe greed and gluttonous gain capitalistically here in the United States. But when we talk back a little bit about Ronald Reagan, so we all know who Ronald Reagan is. There's a term that was coined prior to him running for office, but he really brought this kind of like, just like this, I would call it a slur, like this racist, racially charged term, which was the welfare queen, in which he kind of painted this picture of a Black woman living in poverty and having children for the simple fact that she was going to be gaining a check from each child. And so he actually used that term while he was running for office for his presidency. And if you look at the rates of Latinos who actually voted for him, it was a high number. A lot of people kind of bought into that idea of like, well, he's going to save us from these people who are living off of the system. And so when we talk about theoretically this idea that large power, white power structures work to divide us in order to gain more power, like this is literally how he did it. He literally put people against each other to gain unlimited power in the United States. And so what we had was this depiction of this welfare queen in contrast with this idea that Latinx immigrants were coming in and being these hard workers and the good labor hand for the United States. And so I don't know if immigrants were sold this narrative. Well, they were sold this narrative, or if they even believed it, right? But they were able to contrast themselves like, well, I don't take welfare, or I work hard for what I have, and I'm coming over here to put food on the table and work, which is not necessarily not true, but it was like a falsified idea that you were being a good part of society and you were going to be welcomed, like this false idea that you would be welcomed into society if you were doing the opposite of what the stereotypical welfare queen was doing. And so that kind of leads us into, and we know that it's untrue, right? Because we also see this influx of immigrant labor coming in because of the practices of the United States that went into Latin America and dismantled many of their economic structures. So everything is connected in one way or another if we just like dig a little bit deeper past the surface. Another thing is the idea of union work, right? So unions were created, and what they did once they were integrated was allow many Black families to earn living wages and be able to sustain their families. We know that unions really brought to the forefront a lot of working class people's ability to sustain their families and have medical benefits, and it was just like a positive thing, right? And so when we have immigrant labor coming in because of the destruction of their economies at home in their home countries, now we have this idea that like union work is no longer as valuable in a capitalist structure because they will be able to pay an immigrant or undocumented worker who is a non-union member a lesser wage. Right. And so this became a huge point of tension for the Black and brown community, because now what it is painted like is brown people are coming in and taking my job. And why are they coming in and taking their jobs? Because again, going back to what you said earlier, Seb, there's this competition for a very small, limited amount of resources. And the capitalist structure, there's like 6 billionaires, right, that are continuing to benefit off of all of this over and over again. And so granted, when you're trying to feed your family and you're working day in and day out, it's very hard to like look and see what is happening around you, or the ability, right? It's a privilege to sit back and think about how structures are affecting you every day. But unfortunately, this was what happened. And so that created a huge point of tension between the Black and brown community, while powerful white institutions continued to just gain these vast amounts of economic gain from what was happening between the two communities. I think it wouldn't be a thorough conversation if we don't bring in the prison industrial complex in California. We have one of the largest prison systems in the entire world, I believe, here. And so to not mention it in this conversation, I think would be just wouldn't be conducive, right? So we talk about how Black and brown men and women have been, disproportionately affected by the prison industrial complex. We know that in California, when California prisons became private, there was this influx. I mean, thousands and thousands of people became incarcerated for large amounts of time because somebody was benefiting off of maintaining their incarceration. And what we know about the prison system is that up until 2008, it was segregated by race. And, the California prison institutions claim that it was to keep people from being violent against each other, but in fact was perpetuating these racial lines and divisions that were created in prison and then upon release were brought back into society. So we know that prisons are the breeding ground for intense racial tensions between Black, brown, and white communities, right? And so we know a lot of our Black and brown brothers, right, that come out of prison and hold these intense racist thoughts, right, and racist attitudes, one, because of the trauma that they experienced, but also because there was no assistance in understanding anything other than surviving, right? And so if you don't get the assistance or somebody to be able to talk you through this, you're coming out holding these deeply rooted painful, traumatic experiences that are going to translate into racist behavior and upholding racist systems that only benefit white people, right? So there's still this mystified idea, or this incorrect idea that somehow you are protecting your own, when if we look back at the macro level, we are only protecting a system that serves white supremacy. Okay. And so, hand in hand with the prison industrial complex is the system of gangs in LA, right? Gangs initially began to protect people of color from white cops, from white folks that were going into Black and brown neighborhoods and terrorizing folks. So Black and brown folks created gangs as a way to protect their own blocks. It wasn't, at the inception of gangs, it wasn't what we see today, right? And then white flight happens in a lot of these communities. And so white folks leave these communities, and all that is left are very limited resources. In fact, less resources than when white people lived there, because now there is no incentive for institutions to provide the same sort of social welfare because white people don't live there anymore. And Black and brown folks. So you have limited resources, Black and brown folks. It's a perfect recipe to begin this sort of competition or survival of who gets to reap the benefits of whatever's left.
Right.
And so that becomes, we see intense gang wars that either result in deaths, right, which further dig these deeply rooted traumatic relationships, or they end up in prison where they then began to foster, if they hadn't already, deeply rooted, racist ideals of how to survive in the world. So it's important to realize that while these are many of folks' experiences, and maybe just like second thoughts, like, oh yeah, that's just the way that things are. Like, these are all very pre-planned and pre-thought out systems of how to maintain oppression, one, but also how to maintain a division between two communities that if working together, they would have been so successful in gaining some sort of, whether it be political power, economic power, or justice overall.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, I really appreciate all that context, because I think a lot of these comments that we're talking about, of like what we've been seeing and reading and hearing, often come without any foundation, right? Or any kind of real, not foundation, because I think those ideas come from the idea that white supremacy is working, right? White supremacy works when people of color, Black and Latinx, or Black and non-Black communities start to believe those things that white people are perpetuating about each other, right? So it's like, when you have those tensions, I think, boiling up, I think it's important to note that where those origins are coming from, right? And I think that those like anti-Black sentiments or rhetoric that you see in Mexican and Latinx communities, at least in LA, right? We can see how they develop, given what you're saying, with this kind of longer history and what happens within the prison industrial complex. We see it in the schools. We see it like in just kinds of in neighborhoods in general. And I think there's something that you said in the last episode that really has been sticking with me, and in terms of how to work through some of these things, and is like, it's shifting the perspective of like, when you're speaking from a white supremacist standpoint, all of that stuff is true, right? Like, or looks true. Like that Black and brown folks don't show up for each other, or that they're only perpetuating violence amongst each other. And so once I hope, my hope, or our hope, or my hope, is that like these conversations of kind of gaining some context, right, allow you to then maybe step out of that perspective. And it's like, well, how could this look if we're not operating under that mindset, right? And that's what we're saying, like, that there is a longer history of collaboration or coalitional work, or that there are ways of kind of coming together, or bringing each community's issues to the table. Because I think that that's something we don't think about. Like, just because Black and brown people both experience oppression severely at multiple levels, it doesn't mean that their struggles or aims are the same necessarily, right? And that's okay. And so I think that in these conversations, like, I hope I think some of the biggest hurdles in doing this work and unlearning this stuff is really about starting to shift your perspective, and kind of centering. If we know what white supremacy looks like, and these are some of the examples like we've been talking about, right? Then what does it look like when you're not centering that as your point of reference?
Right.
To kind of start,
No, I completely agree. But also, like, what, oh shoot, I lost my train of thought. Well, like, what are you, oh, okay, yes, sorry. So it's like, if you're not centering it, but also what we see in the Latinx community, and I guess partially in the Black community too, but I think overwhelmingly more in the Latinx community, is that this ability to achieve whiteness has been sold, right? This idea that one day you are going to achieve whiteness if you just do X, Y, and Z. And so, one, you are living in a system that is already choosing to impose upon you this need to disassociate yourself from other people of color, more specifically newly arrived immigrants and the Black community, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also like this false narrative or this false notion that you will one day be 100% accepted.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that that's impossible to achieve. So if we know that that's impossible to achieve, of ever achieving true whiteness, right, when you are just a wasp, like as white as they come, that's not probably
Mm-hmm.
not going to happen. So if we know that that's never going to happen, then you are playing and dancing for the man, and by the man I mean the white supremacist structure in which we live in, for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, you are a soldier in a war against Black people and people like yourself.
Right. That
And
make
you
that
are
may cause like a false sense of upward
success,
mobility. Yeah.
right?
Or a
And
relative and false
and don't
sense.
get me wrong, right? Like upward mobility can be possible, but
Of
that does
course.
not mean that you are being completely accepted into society. One, as a white individual, and two, that if shit were to ever pop off, you are still not white. So
As
if
we
they're
are
Titanic
seeing.
sinking, you are still not going to get a life raft,
Right.
okay? But keep thinking
That's
you
what
will.
boggles that's what blows my mind though. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
because I think so many non-Black Latinx people really truly believe that.
Right.
Um, and they you know, I think build their alliances and perspectives with that as the same way that white supremacy cherishes whiteness, right? In the same way that it is
Mm-hmm.
the most kind of like precious thing that they could hold on to in the sense of you know, we're saying upward mobility or acceptance or whatever, however you want to kind of interpret it as.
Right.
Um, and I think that kind of goes into that next idea about the ideology of like the crumb mindset,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it's like a scarcity model that like resources are scarce for people of color always and in general, and that there's somehow, you know, and that we see that. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, because I know you had made some notes
But
about how
yeah,
that looks
so
in terms of redlining and all of that.
right. So, and not to like go too deep into any one of these, right? Because we're just providing examples. But redlining, in case you all don't know what that is when counties or cities were able to impose restrictions on Black folks and brown folks in order to not allow them to purchase a home, or if they didn't have the grounds to prevent them from purchasing a home, they would like astronomically hike up the price of that home. So there was no way that they would purchase it.
Right.
And so what that did was maintain all white communities to avoid white flight. And that was the real estate industry. Okay. That
Mm,
is another institution, right? Home ownership is such a huge point of wealth gaining for people.
mm,
And if
mhm.
Black and brown communities cannot gain wealth, then we will never be able to compete with centuries old wealth accumulation of white folks, right? So that's
Right.
one. Two is loans. So say I do decide that I'm in a place now as a Black or brown person to purchase a home, and I'm going to the bank and I want a loan. Guess who's in charge of giving out loans at that point, right? And
Right.
so they're either going to not provide you a loan, or your interest is going to be so astronomical that by the time you're done purchasing it, you've now paid for an entire other loan from the bank. So that is
Hmm.
also chipping away at your wealth accumulation. And mind you, these are happening to both Black and brown folks in LA, in California, while white people are like, let me just walk around, everything's fine. Mind you, this was during the golden years of the United States, right? And I use that in quotations because that was during the time where it was the car, the white picket fence. It was after World War II, or
Hmm.
I don't know my wars, sorry.
Yeah.
But it was after
Yeah.
war.
Well, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
And so that is kind of like what folks are competing for, to achieve this like American dream white picket fence, which was
Hmm.
just not going to be possible for Black and brown communities because institutions did everything they could to maintain them out of that conversation. And then obviously we also have education, where we know that Black and brown communities had severely underfunded schools, which made it nearly impossible for them to gain the education that they deserved in order to continue their education after high school, one, or two, went to a high school where their advisor told them that they should just be an auto shop or not have any sort of aspirations for college or continuing their education. And so Black and brown people are fighting to get even through the door of what
Mm-hmm.
white people are given so freely. And
Mm-hmm.
so at some point, we know that that's going to come to a head, to a competition, because if we all can't get through the door, whoever one of us does is going to survive and live a fruitful life, right?
Right.
In quotations, because that's the promise you're given. So now we're going to battle it out until we figure out which one of us deserves or is allowed to obtain that reality.
Right. And I will say, I think it was after World War II that you do see also like a influx of migration of Black folks from the Midwest and the South coming to
Mhm.
California, because of California at that, like in what you're saying about like the golden years, like I think the West Coast and LA specifically kind of became a place where all that was like possible. You know what I mean? Like in that time period,
Yeah,
and
right.
so you do see that. And then in the 70s and 80s, you know, getting also large influxes of Mexican and Central American immigrants also coming into um, LA. And so you have, you know, this kind of multi-racial, multi-ethnic thing happening, right? Coalescing in the same kind of largely geographic region. Obviously, some areas more concentrated. Um, but
Right.
yeah. So I think those things are important to keep in mind in terms of these like conversations around Black and Latinx or non-Black Latinx people in the context of what's happening. Um,
And the
you know, and to,
historical relationship, right?
right. And that these things, you know, none of this is new. None of these things happen in a vacuum or just kind of happen out of nowhere. Um, you know, I think part of what Gay Johnson says in that book that I mentioned earlier, she's like, you can't, to be able to envision a future and practice a future, you have to kind of look back at the past, right? The past kind of tells you where you've been, or at least where you're trying to go. And that past is longer than I think a lot of times people know or really kind of can grasp
Mm.
or have been exposed to. Um, you know, I think of like what would the world look like in LA amongst Black and Latinx youth or children, right? If they're learning this history of like a history of collaboration between their two communities.
And a
And
closer alignment with the struggle, right? Like with the two
right.
struggles. Obviously, like you mentioned earlier, the struggles are very vastly different experiences historically, right? But
Hmm.
also at this point today, the parallels in just like
Yeah.
social issues, right, are a lot closer than they are not.
Right.
And I think that that thought makes a lot of folks that cannot comprehend the importance of the Black Lives Matter uncomfortable.
Right. Um, yeah, I think we wanted to shift gear a little bit to something that we mentioned at the beginning in terms of the stuff that we've been seeing on like the conversations around on social media around or by non-Black Latinx people, specifically
Right.
Mexican folks. Um, so the idea of like seeing signs or posts that say Mexican Lives Matter, um, which, you know, I think saying anything besides Black Lives Matter at this point is, I think, a tactic being used to derail Black Lives Matter or to derail kind of like the impetus or at least the purpose of what that movement is advocating for um, and fighting for right now and has been fighting for. Um, and if we're, again, coming from that crumb mindset or that ideology of scarcity, right, that somehow the idea that you supporting Black Lives Matter and protesting is somehow ignoring or forgetting about the struggles of Mexican folks and or immigrants and or undocumented immigrants.
Right.
Um, that it's somehow erasing those struggles, that it's somehow forgetting about the fact that there are detention centers which are equivalent to concentration camps all over the country with children separated from their families, with people in poor conditions in those detentions and those camps, right? With poor access to like, or giving them really poor meals and just housing and hygiene and all of that stuff, right? Very dehumanizing. I don't think, and I think, you know, we've mentioned this time and time again, right? Mexican or Latinx people are not a race. uh,
Yeah,
technically.
can you break that down a little bit? Because I think that might be like the point of understanding what we mean in this case a little bit more, right? Because
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
So, right. So when we talk about race, and this is just, like I said, I know we've mentioned a little bit, but just to kind of revisit that, is race refers directly to like someone's phenotype, right? There's nothing that makes people of different races inherently different biologically. Um, and I always tell my students, like, if you were to operate or, open the human body of a white person, black person, like the physiology of the inside of the body, like, is the same. What race is really referring to are the kind of phenotypical features, and phenotype referring to everything from skin tone and skin color to facial features to hair texture, that are different amongst different races, obviously, right? But don't actually mean that there's actually any kind of biological difference. It's just a physical difference of like appearance.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we say racism, right, is a structural kind of practice that is rooted in white supremacy to oppress um, Black folks and people of color on the basis of their race, um, then that's when we say race, is a social construct in that it only has meaning because we've assigned meaning to it, right? We've
Right.
assigned that, and because those different racial groups do experience the world differently based on how their appearance is, right? So I hope that's kind of clear in terms of like how to hold race. And that's like a very flat and simplistic kind of understanding. When we talk about ethnicity, ethnicity then refers to all the kind of cultural dimensions of someone's identity, right? So ethnicity can refer to nationality if you're taking it from that perspective of like Mexican American,
Mm-hmm.
Salvadoran, whatever, versus or cultural practice or cultural values. Ethnicity can be built around language, right? If you say the thing that unites all Latinx people is the relationship to Spanish, I don't know if that's true or not, right? But that might be a form of like an ethnic um, something that
Marker.
organizes people around
Mm-hmm.
ethnicity. It could be religion, it could be culture, it could be cultural practice, and it doesn't necessarily
Food.
need to be nationality, right? Because you could be there's ethnic groups that kind of exist in multiple countries, right?
Correct.
And so those are kind of the distinctions. But Latinx people, because of the history of colonization, because the history of what the Latin American kind of space, and if you're talking about the Caribbean to Mexico down to the tip of Argentina in South America, right? Because of its relationship to colonization, has a vastly diverse racial history and identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Black folks in virtually all parts of Latin America, white folks, obviously, if you're talking about colonization, mixed folks, indigenous folks, right? Um, Asian folks, Arab people, Jewish people, right? Like the racial makeup of what it means to be Latinx is so vast that that's why when we say it's not a racial group, it's not, right? But people who are Latinx, especially if you are in the spectrum that's not on the like that's further away from whiteness, right? You do still there is racism is still experienced, right? And people still experience racism and feel racism. Um,
Because your race is different, or it
because you're
is,
right, if you are
yeah.
Black, Mexican, or Indigenous, or
There are racial
phenotypically,
differences. Yeah.
yes. Um,
And that kind of oh, sorry, go ahead.
but it's not the same to say like if as a white Latinx person saying I experience racism, like you may experience discrimination that's rooted in racism because oftentimes, right, non-Black Latinx people get racialized as being a person of color, even if they're not phenotypically darker, right? So to racialize meaning that like um,
It's coming from the white perspective of
right, and
you
it's
are
assigning a
other.
meaning to that race that's rooted in
Correct.
racism, regardless of kind of who the person is or what their phenotype is. I know it's kind of
Right.
complicated, but that's kind of a way to kind of separate it. So it's not to say that Mexican folks don't experience racism; they absolutely do. Um,
Right. And I think,
uh, Go ahead.
yeah, but I think like one, Mexican people obviously experience racism. Uh, Latinx, even non-Black Latinx folks throughout California specifically have a long history of like oppression and like a very dark history of how the United States has welcomed them and or pushed
Or
them
not.
out and pushed
Right.
them back in, right?
Yeah.
And then not welcome them after they force them, right? That's like a whole nother conversation. But
Yeah.
I think what is important to pull out here and why Mexican Lives Matter kind of doesn't sit so well on our ears in this moment is because Mexican is not a race. And so while Mexican lives obviously matter, what we're saying here is that within the Mexican ethnicity, there can be Black folks and there can be white folks. And white Mexicans are probably not going to experience the same level of police brutality. And this, I'm using that as an instance now because that's what we're talking about now, the way that a Black Mexican or a Blaxican individual might experience police brutality or interactions with police in general. And so this kind of goes back to the even like the racism within our own communities, right? Or the uplifting or the special preference to when a baby is born and is light, like, ay, qué güerito tan bonito, or ay, qué bonitos ojos azules, ay, blah, 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 right? Like, why is it so exciting when a kid comes out with green eyes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know our histories are vastly like we're mutts, but
Mm-hmm.
also how come your kid has green eyes when no one else has green eyes? You know, like why isn't that the conversation? Okay.
And now
Um,
talking to your white mailman.
right. But like that's also a reality within our
Mm-hmm.
communities, right? So Mexican is in the term Mexican Lives Matter, it's encompassing folks that may not even require a Lives Matter extra note, subtitle, subnote, right?
Right.
It would be like saying all lives matter because within the tab of Mexican, we have all different kinds of races. So
Right.
it just doesn't make sense. The way that all lives matter doesn't make sense in this time and day and age, right?
Right.
Um, and
And I would say
also,
too. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I, I feel like this is a message for the white Mexican folks who listen, and I know y'all are here, so hi. Um,
Welcome.
but the dissonance where it's like they are blonde, blue-eyed, light-skinned Mexican who are referring to themselves as brown or referring to themselves as people of color. Because of their close relationship to oppression or racism or discrimination of, whether it's for themselves directly or because of their community or because of their, proximity to,
Right.
or maybe even it's because of their legal status, right? Like you could still be blonde and blue eyed and undocumented, right? Like I think this is where those things get complicated because people want to use labels of ethnicity and race to kind of neatly organize people into boxes, right? Um, Obviously,
And
we know
it's
that's
not
not
to
how I. Oh, go ahead.
And it's not to say that though, like being undocumented does not put you at an intense higher risk than other folks,
Oh, of
right?
course, of
Like that's
course.
not what you're saying at all. What we're saying is that when we talk about um, like a means, a purpose for a police officer to pull you over, it's not going to be on the basis of what you look like,
Mhm.
right? Like obviously, if they do pull you over and you're at risk being an undocumented person, but that's not why you got pulled over in the first place.
Right.
Like I think we're talking about two different things when we talk about the struggles of all Mexicans and the Black Lives Matter movement.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think we've also seen a lot of signs that say like Latinx for Black Lives Matter. Baby girl, there are Black Latinx people. Like to say that Latinx for Black Lives Matter is like saying Black for Black Lives Matter. Like, okay, maybe yes, but also like it's taking out that there are Black
Well,
Latinx
right.
people
It's saying
because you're
I'm
not
not.
centering them ever.
Yeah. That's exactly what that is. And I've seen a lot of pretty progressive people and organizations post stuff like that recently. And I also feel like maybe it's not my place to like say something or whatever, but it is kind of like an awkward pill to swallow.
Yeah. And I think that's
Because,
more on the West Coast, because on the East
yeah,
Coast, there is
oh, for sure.
obviously higher populations of Black Latinx people.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. It's another reminder that we are largely talking about LA based context
Yeah,
because of our experience is in LA. Um,
right.
yeah, so I think those are some things to think about, right? Like, because
And also,
oh, go ahead.
I think it's also important to realize that, yes, there are people within like the Mexican community that experience police brutality, but
Of
we
course.
have to ask ourselves why it is so uncomfortable to center Black people when we're talking about this. Like,
Hmm.
it's so, why is it uncomfortable for Black folks to be at the front, at the forefront of this movement for you?
Hmm.
Like, why is that not okay for you when you have probably spent your entire life centering white people? Like, why
Hmm.
is it uncomfortable for Black people to be at the center of the conversation? Like, that is something that we should just ask ourselves, period. Because if we
Right.
talk about fighting for injustice, and you want to talk about like Aslan Libre and power to the people and Raza, then yes, to all of those things or whatever. But also, why is it so uncomfortable for you to like, not even allow, because you're not in the position to allow anybody to do anything, but to accept that Black people are at the front of this movement right now?
Right.
And that's just something to ponder. I don't have the answers for you as to why you feel that way, but think about it.
Yeah, I think, and I think that when we talk about, the abolition of prisons and the abolition of police as a system, it goes hand in hand with the abolition of ICE and the abolition of um,
100%.
detention centers and detaining people in terms of like what migration to this country looks like. So if you can't, like, so that's, I think, something that if you are having an issue with, to explore too, right? Like the defunding of police goes aligned directly with the defunding of ICE, or a movement to also defund ICE and to end ICE and abolish ICE.
Yeah. I think
Um,
one last
yeah.
point that people would bring up, and that I've seen people bring up, right, is this idea that Black people didn't support our movement, or Black people
Mm,
are not supporting our movement. I get back to your point of saying, like, we still have kids in cages. What about us, right?
mm-hmm,
Fighting again, um, fighting over crumbs, because
mm-hmm.
these are systemic issues that are consistently ignored. But one, that's incorrect. I mean, I can provide my own personal experience, but I'm sure many of you who have been marching since 2006, or since you were able to be a part of this, have seen Black people at immigrant marches, at women's marches, at marches against Donald Trump, at, they show up. I've seen them. I don't know, like I don't understand where this idea, this notion that people are saying just so absolutely true. Like, Black people don't show up for us. Like, do you have proof? Are you just deciding? Like, that's very dangerous when people just decide to make these like blanket comments that they
Mm-hmm.
say so like emboldened, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also, it's important, even if they didn't, right? So even if Black people did not show up for these movements, which again, the idea that they didn't show up for immigrant marches or kids in cages is also removing the idea that there are Black Latinx folks who are experiencing oppression from those two topics.
And that there
Okay,
are Black undocumented immigrants from all over the world, not just Latin
every
America.
all over the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So check yourself just in that statement, assuming that it is only a brown issue that Black people would have no sort of like buy
Relationship
into
to
or
legal
relationship
status.
to.
Yeah.
Right. And two, demonstration is not transactional. Social justice is not transactional. So this idea that when we're pushing towards uh, a world or a society that is just, does not require, well, I'll scratch my back or you scratch yours. That is such a colonizer concept, and such a concept of white supremacy and
Capitalism.
capitalism, where we are not able to do anything unless we're reaping a direct benefit or some sort of monetary or privilege or access compensation in return.
Mm-hmm.
Show up for struggles that are not your own, and you don't have to gain anything from it, because what
That's
you're gaining is a society that is more just, right? If that's really what you say you're doing.
right. Yeah, I mean, that's revolutionary, right? Like,
Right.
and that's coalitional, and that's being in actual solidarity of, and that's not just for Black and Brown, but for anything, right? Like, and I won't get into it too, but like Black and Brown communities both have often ostracized their queer and trans
Yeah.
members of the community, right? And so um, I think if you're talking about liberation, if you're talking about abolishing police, abolishing ICE, you're talking about freedom fighting,
Mm-hmm.
it, you have to kind of go into it knowing that perhaps your direct experiences and identities and needs will maybe not be the first, right? But knowing that if you're fighting for the liberation of Black people, you're really fighting for the liberation of everybody.
Right.
Um, and that has to, and that also is a different perspective to approach all of this rather than what we've been saying of these like pitting groups against each other, or
Yeah.
fighting for resources or scarcity models of coalitional work or social
And
justice.
this can't go without saying, folks who are the loudest, okay, complaining, okay,
Who's it?
about not being present for La Raza, okay, having all of a sudden these well thought out, extensive political opinions about your history and about the current status of the world, okay, you didn't vote, okay. I know that's a
Right.
privileged thing to say, but if you had the ability to vote and you chose not to vote, okay, where were you during the marches? Where were you during the elections? Where were you during the census? Where were you when we needed you to write to your mayor or your
Representatives.
congressman, representatives? Like,
Right. And I saw a meme that said like, oh, where were you for the immigrant marches? Like, bitch, you weren't there either, so shut the fuck up.
100%,
Like, if your ass was there, you wouldn't be saying what you're saying now.
because you would have seen who actually shows up, one. And two, I feel like it just gives you such a perfect thing to oppose Black Lives Matter. And I think you said it, it codes your anti-Blackness. If you
Mm-hmm.
can pit this reason as to why you're not supportive, then you're not racist. You're just wanting people to show
Right.
up for you.
Right. Um,
Trash.
so, and I kind of want to make that a disclaimer for you listening, or if you're having this conversation with someone who is one of these people, like, if you are saying this, know that you are choosing the side of the oppressor. If you are saying shit like Mexican lives matter and what about the kids in detention, and like you are choosing to buy into this idea that there are more differences than areas to work together, and that's what you have chosen to participate in. You know what I mean? Like
Actively.
that's the hill you want to die on. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
that's the issue that is going to be your deal breaker. Then I would
Yeah.
encourage you and invite you to kind of reevaluate um, why you feel the need. You know, like why does that need to be where what is centered? Why does that need to be the most important conversation? The same way that last week I was saying, if your most important issue out of everything that's happening is to defend the fact that there are so quote unquote good cops, then like I can't help you there, but like maybe evaluate that within yourself, reflect,
Right.
right? Why you feel
But no,
so compelled to actually have to defend that versus Black people who are dying.
but call me when white people have welcomed you
Right.
wholeheartedly. Like, let
Well,
me know
and I
how
will
that
say
works out
that
for
if we're talking
you.
about white Latinx people specifically, they could very well never, you know what I mean? Like they could very well be, even if they're fooling white people into thinking that they're white, you know?
Right.
We have relatives who do that. Like
Yeah, we have aunts.
we have aunts, we have tias who are not tias anymore
Right.
because, you know, they're Trump
They're
supporters. But
tias.
so, yeah, so I think that's just something to kind of keep in mind, right? And we know we want to say one thing too. We are working on putting like a Spanish episode together because we know that these conversations also need to be had with our actual tias and
Uh-huh.
tios and abuelitas and you know
And
whoever else.
yeah, and
Go ahead.
oftentimes language is a barrier because we may be in my case, I call myself fluent in Spanish, but what I've learned in having to present at work and stuff is that the vocabulary that I have in Spanish is not the same with
Hmm.
the vocabulary I've acquired in English. So
Hmm.
I think Seb and I are going to do our homework and our research to make sure that we find the language in Spanish to then provide you, and then you can hopefully use it as a tool if you need to have a conversation with your ama or your abuelita or your abuelito to have a conversation about the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement and what it means for our communities.
Because I think
And
that's when we say that the reflection and all of that stuff, it starts obviously with yourself, but then once you are getting there, you have a responsibility now to also ignite those conversations in your own homes or in your own communities,
yeah,
with people
and
who
I think
will
that
listen to you.
right, and I think that leads us right into our point of all this, which is this. And I don't know, Seb, if you know off the top of your head whose quote that is. I say it
I
all the
don't.
time, but I don't. So this idea that we're not free until we're all free,
Yeah.
right? I think that goes into if you are unable to see that in the past couple weeks, the Black Lives Matter is pushing to dismantle, and we see it in different areas of the world already, that it's already working to dismantle the systemic racism and the militarization of police and this idea of police brutality. If you cannot see how our community as non-Black Latinx people will benefit from the restructuring of these power systems, and how if you decide to back Black Lives Matter, how you could aid in the restructuring of all of this. Like if you cannot see how the Black Lives Matter movement is not pushing for a more equitable society for everybody, then you are literally choosing to be against the Black Lives Matter no matter what, even if it means a better future for you. And that is a conversation that I would invite you to have with yourself as to why, even if at the end of the day you will be receiving a world that is more like safer, less dangerous, more
Mhm.
equitable, you still don't want anything to do with it because Black people are at the forefront. What is that saying to you?
Right. I want to say too that, and we say this all the time, like everyone's on a different place in their journey. So whether this is, standard 101 and you already know all of this, great. Or if this is the first time you're hearing this, welcome. Or if you're somewhere in the middle and you know what I mean, like I think you should, rather than be hard on yourself, I think it's more about reflection and introspection. And then once you've done that, however you do that, right, it's about action. Like that's the next step.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I think what we always say, and we refer to ourselves when we say this, is there's always room to know more. There's no, I mean, we don't
Mm-hmm.
know everything, right? And so there's always room to learn and to educate yourself and find resources. That Google is a magical tool that way. So before we wrap up, I wanted to end with a quote actually from Gay Johnson, who actually I had an opportunity to see speak a few times when I was at Santa Barbara for grad school. And she is not only like a brilliant writer and scholar, but just like gives off this very positive and kind energy. And so I don't know, I wanted to share that because I feel like I
Yay.
have that in my head as I read. But she says in her book, Spaces of Conflict, I mentioned earlier, right? In relation to Black and Brown relations, in reference to Black and Brown relations in LA, she says, quote, the social problems and internal tensions that plague us in separate struggles can feel and be more complex when we form movements and share dreams with other collectivities. If we wish to envision and enact a future in which mutual and separate struggles will come to just fruition, we have to rewrite the story we've been told about who we are and about our value to each other. And I think
That's
that's just
beautiful.
a really beautiful way to kind of wrap this. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
I love that. So yes, folks, we know this was a lot. Hopefully it was helpful. If you have thoughts or, you can always email us at cafeconchisme@gmail.com. Cafe con Chisme is our Twitter, our Instagram, our Facebook. We know that right now is a time to have grace with folks and are calling folks in rather than out. And we know that during this time, we want to make sure that you are not just knocking on the doors of your Black friends and asking them to help you make sense of what's happening. So we want to be a resource to you in any way that we can, to alleviate any sort of extra labor that may be put on Black folks right now. And so, yeah, reach out to us if you have questions or want to continue having conversations like this. That's all we have for today, y'all. Like we always say, love yourself, love your life.
And remember that you know more than you think you know.
Bye.